When Emma Sullivan spent her last $200 on a crumbling lighthouse at a coastal bankruptcy auction, it was a desperate gamble to secure shelter after losing everything to crushing medical debt. Following her husband's sudden death in a boating accident and the devastating legal fees that consumed their life savings, she never imagined that a collapsing basement wall would reveal a hidden chamber containing maps, ledgers, and a breathtaking collection of uncut diamonds belonging to notorious 1920s rum-runner Captain James Blackwood, whose legendary smuggling operation had been sought by historians and treasure hunters for nearly a century. A discovery that would make her the target of unscrupulous collectors, thrust her into high-stakes negotiations with museums and historical societies, and ultimately lead to an expedition that would forever change her life and rewrite the history of Prohibition-era coastal smuggling operations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The foreclosure notice arrived on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning, tucked between an insurance denial and a past-due utility bill, as if its life-shattering contents were just another piece of ordinary mail. Notice of property seizure, 21 days to satisfy outstanding obligations. Emma Sullivan stared at the bold crimson letters, feeling her world collapse as she stood in the small kitchen of her beachside cottage in Harbor Point, Maine. Through the mist-covered window, she could see the turbulent gray waters of Penobscot Bay that had been both solace and tormentor since Michael's passing 14 months ago. "Not now," Emma whispered, her trembling fingers scanning the document for any possible reprieve or extension. There wasn't one. The entire stretch of coastal properties had been purchased by resort developers planning an exclusive wellness retreat. All residents had 3 weeks to settle their debts or face immediate eviction. No exceptions, no delays, no second chances. At 47, Emma had never imagined finding herself here, a widow with a master's degree in marine biology, recently terminated when her research center lost federal funding, and now facing homelessness in a rental market that seemed deliberately designed to exclude people like her. She set the seizure notice on the weathered pine counter and drew a shaky breath, mentally cataloging her rapidly diminishing options. Her savings had dwindled to exactly $247 after 14 months of medical battles with Michael's cancer, funeral expenses, and a crushing weight of bills that kept arriving even after death had supposedly settled all accounts. Her sister lived in Arizona and was struggling through her own financial difficulties. Friends had already extended themselves beyond reasonable limits during those first devastating months after Michael's diagnosis. Emma walked to the front window, her gaze drawn to the lighthouse that stood like a granite sentinel on the jagged promontory beyond her cottage. For 15 years, it had been the constant backdrop to her marriage with Michael, its powerful beam sweeping across their cottage each night, like a protective guardian watching over their dreams. Now it stood as abandoned as she felt decommissioned 7 years ago, when satellite navigation systems had rendered human lighthouse keepers obsolete, a relic of a more personal time. She lifted the framed photograph of Michael and herself on their wedding day. His weathered fisherman's hands contrasted with her delicate academic's fingers, both of them radiant with the certainty that they could navigate any future together. "What would you do, love?" she asked the silent image, her voice breaking on the familiar question. The weight of her isolation pressed down like the storm clouds gathering over the bay. Michael had been her anchor, her navigator, the one who always found solutions when problems seemed insurmountable. Without him, every decision felt like steering through fog without compass or chart. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Emma had met Michael Sullivan 12 years earlier during a marine conservation project. He'd been a third-generation lobsterman whose intimate knowledge of local waters had proven invaluable to her research on coastal ecosystem preservation. She had been the scientist documenting changing fish migration patterns, and he had been the local expert whose practical experience gave context to her data. Their professional relationship had slowly transformed into friendship, then love, as she witnessed his incredible work ethic and quiet wisdom in the face of a changing climate and declining fish stocks. Michael had been the son of Irish immigrants, a man who'd navigated Penobscot Bay's treacherous waters since childhood through sheer determination and an encyclopedic knowledge of ocean currents and weather patterns. Emma, whose own academic career had taken her from prestigious marine biology programs to fieldwork across 3 continents, understood the pride and purpose he found in continuing his family's maritime tradition while adapting to environmental realities. Their wedding had been simple but profound, held on the beach with lobster boats forming an impromptu honor guard offshore. Michael's fishing community had volunteered to build the driftwood arch where they exchanged vows, creating something beautiful and ephemeral to mark their commitment. Emma's research colleagues had traveled from universities across the country, celebrating her happiness after years of dedication to marine conservation. Together, they'd saved diligently to purchase their small cottage, choosing location over size because they both loved waking to the sight of the ocean and the lighthouse, standing guard over the bay. Michael had spent weekends maintaining their home, weatherproofing against coastal storms and salt spray, transforming the modest structure into a sanctuary against Maine's harsh winters. Emma had created a terraced garden where they grew salt-tolerant herbs and vegetables, finding peace in nurturing life from the rocky soil. Those had been golden years, coming home each evening to share stories of research breakthroughs or unusual catches, planning small improvements to their cottage, taking long walks along the shore at low tide, dreaming of the marine conservation center they hoped to establish someday. Michael would point to changes in tidal patterns, explaining the ecological implications with the precision of someone who truly understood the sea's language. Emma would identify shorebirds and marine species, mapping the complex relationships that maintained coastal biodiversity. They had formed a perfect partnership of practical wisdom and scientific understanding. The cancer diagnosis had shattered everything in a single afternoon. Michael had been experiencing back pain for months but attributed it to years of hauling lobster traps. When he finally agreed to see a doctor, the diagnosis was devastating advanced pancreatic cancer with multiple metastases. The prognosis gave them months, not years. Emma's world had ended that Thursday afternoon in the oncologist's office. She'd been documenting horseshoe crab populations when her phone rang with news that would divide her life into before and after. Before cancer, when everything followed natural patterns. After diagnosis, when nothing would ever follow predictable rhythms again. The medical battle had been overwhelming. Experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. Clinical trials with promising outcomes, but devastating side effects. Alternative therapies sought in desperate hope when conventional medicine offered little optimism. Emma had abandoned her research position to become Michael's full-time caregiver, navigating the bewildering landscape of oncology terminology and treatment protocols. Michael had faced his diagnosis with the same quiet courage he'd shown during northeast gales. "The sea takes what it wants," he'd said, "but we sail anyway." He'd insisted they continue living fully even as his body failed, taking sunset walks when he could still walk, then watching from their porch when mobility became impossible. They'd spent evenings documenting his knowledge of local waters, creating detailed maps and journals that Emma promised to share with younger fishermen. The medical expenses had consumed their savings with terrifying speed. Even with insurance, the out-of-pocket costs for specialized treatments created an endless stream of bills that multiplied faster than Emma could track. Meanwhile, her grief made it impossible to focus on grant applications or research proposals with the precision her field demanded. The Marine Research Center where she'd worked for 8 years had been understanding at first, granting her family medical leave and accommodating her erratic availability. But as months passed and research deadlines approached, Her absence created complications for ongoing projects and funding requirements. When federal budget cuts eliminated their primary grant 6 months after Michael's death, Emma's position became immediately vulnerable. The termination was delivered with institutional delicacy, a brief meeting with the director, a severance package providing 3 months of salary, and assurances that she would receive strong recommendations for future positions. Emma had signed the paperwork in stunned silence, still processing the reality that she'd lost both her husband and her career within a single year. Unemployment benefits provided $1,400 monthly, barely enough to cover basic living expenses, and completely inadequate for the mortgage payments on their cottage. Emma had applied for dozens of marine biology and environmental science positions throughout the Northeast. But the job market was saturated with recent graduates, and many research institutions seemed hesitant to hire someone dealing with obvious personal trauma. The few interview opportunities she'd received had gone poorly. Emma struggled to project the enthusiasm and focus that research organizations expected, and her extended absence had created gaps in her knowledge of recent methodological advances and publication requirements. Younger candidates with specialized technical skills and lower salary expectations consistently received the positions she'd sought. As her savings dwindled and job prospects remained elusive, Emma had been forced to make increasingly desperate financial decisions. She'd sold Michael's boat, their wedding rings, and most of their furniture to pay mounting bills. The cottage that had once been their sanctuary became a constant reminder of everything she'd lost and everything she was about to lose. That evening, after forcing down dinner of instant soup and saltines, all she could afford and stomach, Emma opened her laptop and began the desperate search for affordable housing. The computer, an aging model from her research days, protested as she waited for each page to load on their unreliable rural internet connection. The rental listings might as well have been written in hieroglyphics for all the sense they made to her financial reality. Studio apartments in Harbor Point started at $2,100 per month, nearly 3 times what she currently paid for her 2-bedroom cottage. 1-bedroom units in neighboring towns commanded $1,800 minimum, still impossibly beyond her reach. Application fees ranged from $50 to $100 per property, meaning she could afford to apply for perhaps 2 places before exhausting her remaining funds. Every legitimate listing demanded proof of monthly income at least 3 times the rent amount, an impossible requirement when her unemployment benefits provided barely $1,400 monthly, enough to cover groceries and basic utilities, but nowhere near sufficient for housing deposits, first month's rent, and the mountain of additional fees landlords demanded. Security deposits alone often exceeded her entire remaining savings. Emma spent hours reading rental requirements that seemed designed to exclude people in her situation: perfect credit scores, employment verification, landlord references, proof of renter's insurance, pet deposits, even though she had no pets, cleaning fees, application processing fees, background check fees. The list of financial barriers seemed endless and insurmountable. She called several property management companies, hoping to explain her situation and perhaps find someone willing to work with her circumstances. The conversations were uniformly discouraging. Rental agents spoke in rehearsed scripts about policies and requirements, expressing polite sympathy for her situation, while making it clear that exceptions were not possible in their competitive market. "I understand your circumstances are difficult," one particularly kind agent had explained. "But we have dozens of qualified applicants for every property. Our owners require us to choose tenants who represent the lowest financial risk. I'm sorry, but your current income situation wouldn't meet our minimum requirements." Emma expanded her search radius, looking at apartments an hour inland, where rents dropped slightly but still remained out of reach. She investigated shared housing situations, spare rooms in strangers' homes, converted garages, anything that might provide basic shelter. Each option presented its own complications. Most wanted roommates under 35, non-smokers with perfect credit, professional references she no longer had, or deposits she couldn't afford. The online housing section became her obsession, refreshing every few minutes to catch new listings before other desperate people could respond. She found herself competing with college students whose parents could co-sign leases, young professionals with stable incomes, and retirees with substantial savings. Her widow status and unemployment made her an unattractive candidate, regardless of her education or work history. She applied for low-income housing assistance only to discover waiting lists that stretched for years. Emergency housing programs had residency requirements she didn't meet or were designed specifically for families with children. Social services offered temporary shelter options that required her to surrender her remaining possessions and accept placement in facilities with safety concerns she wasn't prepared to face. The clock on her laptop read 1:37 a.m. when desperation drove her into increasingly unconventional territory. She began searching for foreclosure auctions, sheriff sales, repossessed properties, abandoned buildings, any distressed real estate being liquidated to recover debts. Most listings showed dilapidated houses requiring tens of thousands in renovations, empty lots in remote areas hours from any employment, or commercial properties unsuitable for residential use. Her eyes burned from staring at the screen, and her back ached from hunching over the rickety kitchen table, but she couldn't stop. Each search felt like her last chance to find something, anything, before the 21-day deadline expired and she found herself homeless for the first time in her life. The storm outside intensified, rain lashing against the cottage windows in rhythmic waves that matched her growing anxiety. She could hear the ocean's fury even through the storm, the eternal crash of waves that had once soothed her to sleep, but now sounded like time running out. The lighthouse beam, automated even in its abandonment, continued its eternal sweep across the bay, a reminder of persistence in the face of obsolescence. Emma clicked through page after page of foreclosure listings, each more depressing than the last. Mobile homes in flood zones requiring expensive elevation work. Condemned houses with foundation problems that would cost more to repair than to demolish. Vacant lots suitable only for farming or industrial use, zoned against residential construction. Her heart sank with each impossible option, each dead end that closed off another potential path forward. She found herself reading the tragic stories behind each foreclosure. Families destroyed by medical bankruptcies. Elderly couples who'd lost homes to predatory lending schemes. Small business owners crushed by economic downturns beyond their control. Each listing represented someone else's shattered dreams, making her feel simultaneously less alone and more aware of how common financial devastation had become. And then, buried on page 5 of the county sheriff's auction listings, she found something that made her pause. Former Rock Point Lighthouse in Keeper's Quarters. Minimum bid $150. Property sold as is with no warranties or representations. Structural inspection recommended. Emma almost scrolled past it. What could she possibly do with an abandoned lighthouse? But something made her click on the listing. Perhaps the desperate logic that even an impossible shelter was better than no shelter at all. Or maybe the symbolic connection to the lighthouse that had watched over her marriage for so many years. The listing contained only 5 photographs. The weathered lighthouse tower with its faded white paint and corroded metalwork. The attached keeper's quarters with boarded windows. An interior shot showing dusty furniture draped in protective sheets. A basement area with stone walls and wooden support beams. And an aerial view revealing the property situated on a rocky outcropping that jutted into Penobscot Bay like a natural breakwater. The description was frustratingly sparse. Former Rock Point Lighthouse Tower plus 1,450 square, FT, Keeper's Quarters. Property includes all remaining fixtures and furnishings. Structure appears sound but requires significant renovation and restoration. No utilities currently connected. Zoned historical residential with preservation overlay. Property sold as is without warranties. Buyer responsible for all inspections and due diligence. Emma studied the photographs with growing fascination. The lighthouse tower stood approximately 65 feet tall, its white paint weathered, but still visible against the storm-darkened sky. The attached keeper's quarters appeared to be a substantial, two-story structure with granite foundations and cedar shingle siding that matched the tower. Even in its abandoned state, the building retained a dignity and character that spoke of better days. Her exhausted mind began calculating impossible possibilities. The keeper's quarters could theoretically be made livable with extensive work and investment she didn't have. The lighthouse tower itself might never function again, but the attached living space had potential if someone possessed the skills, resources, and time to undertake a massive renovation project. The historical zoning meant strict limitations on external modifications, but it also suggested possible tax benefits for restoration efforts and potential grants for historical preservation. The isolation would be challenging, accessible only by a narrow coastal road that probably flooded during severe storms. But it would also mean freedom from landlords, rent increases, and eviction notices. It was completely insane. She was a marine biologist, not a contractor or restoration expert. The property was isolated, probably lacking basic utilities, and would require enormous investments of time and money she didn't possess. The minimum bid alone would consume most of her remaining savings, leaving nothing for actual renovation costs. And yet, as she stared at the grainy photographs of the lighthouse keeper's quarters, something stirred in her chest that she hadn't felt since Michael's death. A tiny spark of possibility. A whisper of hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be her solution. Not ideal, not easy, not remotely sensible, but potentially her only path to housing security and independence. Emma imagined Michael's reaction to the lighthouse idea. He would have been immediately intrigued by the maritime heritage, already calculating how to harness the natural elements for sustainable living. "Look at the structure, Em," he would have said. "Built to withstand a century of nor'easters. With some work, we could make this a home." She researched the lighthouse's history, discovering that Rock Point Light had been built in 1879 to guide ships safely through the treacherous waters around Penobscot Bay. The station had been continuously manned until 1989, when automated navigation systems had made lighthouse keepers obsolete. The property had been abandoned for nearly 8 years, during which time it had deteriorated, but apparently avoided major structural damage. "This is absolutely crazy," she told herself, closing the laptop and preparing for bed. But as she lay listening to the storm rage outside, knowing that 21 days remained before losing her cottage forever, the lighthouse continued to occupy her thoughts. What had seemed like midnight desperation began to crystallize into her best, perhaps only option for maintaining any kind of shelter and dignity. The widow, seeking basic survival, had found what might be her most unconventional path forward. The question was whether she possessed enough courage to take it, and whether the abandoned lighthouse might hold more than just shelter in its weathered walls. The morning of the sheriff's auction dawned gray and unforgiving, with fog rolling in from Penobscot Bay like a shroud over Emma's last desperate hope. She had spent the previous 3 days researching everything she could about lighthouse restoration, historical preservation requirements, and the legal implications of purchasing property at a foreclosure auction. The more she learned, the more impossible her plan seemed, and the more determined she became to pursue it. Emma had withdrawn exactly $220 from her dwindling bank account, leaving her with barely enough for groceries through the following week. The extra $70 beyond the minimum bid was her only insurance against being outbid by someone with slightly deeper pockets. She clutched the cashier's check in her trembling hand as she drove her aging Subaru toward the county courthouse, rehearsing arguments to convince herself this wasn't the most reckless gamble of her life. The courthouse was an imposing red brick structure with wide granite steps leading to heavy oak doors. Emma arrived 45 minutes early, hoping to observe the auction process and understand the procedures before her Lighthouse came up for bidding. The auction room was already half filled with people in business attire, professional investors and developers who attended these events regularly, scanning through thick catalogs of distressed properties like shoppers browsing a department store clearance sale. Emma felt completely out of place in her simple navy dress and worn cardigan, clutching her single cashier's check while others around her discussed multiple properties and investment strategies with casual expertise. She registered for bidder number 53, trying to project more confidence than she felt as the clerk explained the rules and requirements. "First time at a foreclosure auction?" asked a distinguished woman with silver hair and kind eyes, noticing Emma's obvious nervousness. The woman's badge identified her as bidder number 19. Emma nodded, grateful for any human connection in the intimidating environment. "Is it that obvious?" "We all started somewhere," the woman replied, introducing herself as Margaret Reynolds. "I've been attending these auctions for over 20 years. Are you looking at residential properties today?" "Actually, yes," Emma admitted. "The old Rock Point Lighthouse. I know it sounds crazy, but I'm planning to restore the keeper's quarters as my home." Margaret's eyebrows rose with genuine interest rather than skepticism. "That's fascinating. Historical properties like lighthouses can be incredibly rewarding restoration projects, though they present unique challenges. The Rock Point station has excellent bones. I've sailed past it many times. What draws you to that particular property?" Emma found herself sharing more than she'd intended about her situation: Michael's death, the job loss, the impending eviction, her desperate need for affordable housing that wouldn't subject her to the whims of landlords or the volatility of rental markets. Margaret listened with the patience of someone who understood that desperate circumstances often led to unconventional solutions. "You know," Margaret said thoughtfully, "lighthouse restoration isn't as impossible as people assume. The structures were built to withstand decades of harsh maritime conditions, so they're typically very sound. The real challenges are utilities and modernization while maintaining historical integrity. But if you're committed to doing the work yourself and can approach it as a long-term project, it's entirely feasible." This unexpected encouragement from an experienced property investor gave Emma hope that her plan wasn't completely insane. Margaret had successfully restored several historical properties, including a converted fishing warehouse that now served as her home and art studio. She offered practical advice about dealing with historical preservation requirements, finding contractors experienced with period restoration, and accessing grants available for lighthouse preservation. "The most important thing," Margaret emphasized, "is patience. These properties reward careful, methodical restoration, but they punish rushing or cutting corners. If you win the bid today, take time to thoroughly assess what you're working with before making any major changes." The auction began promptly at 10 o'clock a.m. with the auctioneer rapidly progressing through a list of foreclosed properties. Emma watched the process with growing anxiety, observing how quickly each property was presented and sold. Most generated little interest, selling close to their minimum bids. But a few prime residential lots sparked bidding wars that drove prices far beyond their starting points. Commercial properties moved even faster, with investors making rapid calculations about rehabilitation costs and potential returns. Emma began to worry that she'd misunderstood something fundamental about the auction process. Perhaps lighthouse properties were more valuable than she had realized, or maybe other bidders had information about the Rock Point station that she lacked. As the morning progressed, Emma's anxiety intensified. Her palms were sweating, her heart rate had accelerated, and she felt increasingly out of place among the professional investors who bid with casual confidence on properties worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. She began second-guessing her decision to risk her last resources on such an uncertain venture. When Lot 37 was announced, former Rock Point, Lighthouse and Keeper's Quarters, Emma's stomach lurched with a combination of terror and anticipation. The auctioneer provided a brief description of the property, emphasizing the as-is nature of the sale and the buyer's responsibility for all inspections and due diligence. Ladies and gentlemen, we have the historic Rock Point Lighthouse, a unique opportunity for restoration enthusiasts. The property includes a lighthouse tower and attached keeper's quarters totaling approximately 1,450 square feet of living space, zoned for historical residential use. Minimum bid is $150. Do I hear $150? Emma's hand trembled as she raised her bitter paddle, her voice catching as she managed to say, "Here, $150 from bidder number 53, the auctioneer announced. Do I hear $175? The room remained silent for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Emma held her breath, wondering if someone would suddenly recognize the value of the property and jump into the bidding. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she waited for competition that would price her out of her last option. $150 going once, the auctioneer called, scanning the room for additional bids. Do I hear $175? Any advance on $150? A man in a charcoal suit near the front of the room half raised his paddle, then seemed to reconsider and lowered it. Emma's pulse spiked with panic. If someone bid against her, she could only go as high as $220 before exhausting her resources entirely. $150 going twice, the auctioneer continued. Final call for the Rock Point Lighthouse. Any advance? The silence stretched impossibly long. Emma felt sweat beading on her forehead as she realized in a few seconds she would either own a lighthouse or have to somehow find another solution to her housing crisis with 3 weeks remaining. Sold to bidder number 53 for $150. The sharp crack of the auctioneer's gavel made Emma jump. Had that really happened? Had she actually purchased a lighthouse for less than the cost of a security deposit on most apartments? The surreal nature of the moment made her wonder if she was dreaming, or if her desperation had finally driven her to complete detachment from reality. The next 2 hours passed in a bureaucratic blur of paperwork, signatures, and transaction processing. The county clerk, a patient woman named Eleanor Thornton, guided Emma through the complex documentation required for the property transfer. She explained that the lighthouse had been abandoned for nearly 8 years, with property taxes unpaid since the Coast Guard had decommissioned it and transferred ownership to the county, which had failed to find a suitable preservation partner or buyer. You should know that this property comes with some unique challenges, Eleanor advised as Emma signed document after document. Historical properties have specific maintenance requirements and preservation restrictions. You'll need to work with the local historical preservation office for any major renovations or modifications. Emma nodded, trying to absorb the implications while still processing the fact that she now owned waterfront property, however problematic it might be. Eleanor provided her with contact information for the county historical preservation officer, building inspection services, and utility companies that would need to assess the property before any restoration could begin. Are you interested in the lighthouse's history? Eleanor asked as they completed the final paperwork. Rock Point Light has quite a story. It's one of the significant lighthouse stations on this stretch of coast. Built in 1879 to guide ships through the dangerous waters around Penobscot Bay, the station was continuously operated for 110 years before automation made lighthouse keepers obsolete. The clerk pulled out a thin file folder containing historical documents about the lighthouse. These came with the property records. There's some interesting information about the various keepers over the years, including some legends about smuggling operations during Prohibition, though I suspect those are more folklore than fact. Emma's attention was caught by the mention of smuggling and prohibition, though she assumed Eleanor was referring to the typical maritime legends that accumulated around old coastal structures. Every lighthouse, shipwreck, and coastal cave seemed to have associated smuggling stories that fired local imagination while rarely having any basis in historical fact. The most documented keeper was a man named Thomas Barrett, who operated the station from 1918 to 1947. He apparently was quite a character, kept extensive records of ships, weather patterns, and local maritime activity. Some of his journals are in the Maine Maritime Museum's archives, if you're interested in researching your property's history. By noon, Emma Sullivan, widow, former marine biologist, and now owner of a defunct lighthouse, clutched a set of keys and property deed in hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The reality of what she'd done was beginning to sink in. She had committed her last financial resources to purchasing a property she'd never physically examined, in a location she'd only seen from a distance, with no clear plan for making it habitable. "Congratulations," Margaret Reynolds said, finding Emma in the courthouse hallway after the auction concluded. "That was quite an adventure you just embarked upon." "I meant what I said about lighthouse restoration being rewarding. You've acquired something truly special." "I'm still not sure if I'm brave or completely desperate," Emma admitted, staring at the keys to her lighthouse as if they were artifacts from another planet. "Sometimes those are the same thing," Margaret replied with a warm smile. "Here's my card. I've worked on some challenging historical restorations over the years, including a decommissioned Coast Guard station that had similarities to your lighthouse. Call me if you need advice or contractor recommendations. And don't hesitate to reach out if you need someone to talk through the overwhelming moments. Every restoration project has them." Emma thanked Margaret and walked slowly to her car, still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. The drive to Rock Point would be her first opportunity to see her property up close, to assess exactly what she had purchased and begin understanding the scope of work required to make it livable. The coastal road to Rock Point was narrow and winding, carved into cliffs that dropped precipitously to the rocky shoreline below. Emma drove carefully, noting that several sections of the road showed signs of erosion and weather damage. During severe storms, this route would likely be treacherous or impassable, making her lighthouse truly isolated from emergency services or supply deliveries. As she rounded the final curve, Rock Point Lighthouse came into full view for the first time. Emma pulled over and stopped the car, overwhelmed by the sight of her new home. The lighthouse tower stood proudly against the gray sky, its white paint weathered but still visible. The attached keeper's quarters was a substantial two-story structure that appeared larger and more solid than the auction photographs had suggested. The setting was dramatically beautiful, the lighthouse perched on a rocky promontory that extended into Penobscot Bay like a stone peninsula, surrounded by churning waves and wheeling seabirds. Even in its abandoned state, the station retained a dignity and purpose that spoke of its long service guiding mariners safely to port. Emma sat in her car for several minutes, trying to absorb the reality that this remarkable place now belonged to her. The lighthouse that had seemed like desperate folly just hours earlier was beginning to feel like a possibility, perhaps even a gift. The structure looked solid and well built, designed to withstand decades of coastal storms and salt spray. Using the keys from the auction, Emma approached the heavy wooden door to the keeper's quarters. The lock was stiff with age and salt corrosion, but the key turned with effort, opening the door to her new home. The smell hit her immediately, the distinctive scent of a long-abandoned space. Salt, dust, and old wood, but not the musty odor of rot or structural decay she'd feared. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the boarded windows, illuminating floating dust particles and casting long shadows across wide plank pine floors. The main living area was approximately 22 feet square, with a massive granite fireplace along one wall. Period furniture remained throughout, draped in protective sheets that suggested someone had cared enough to preserve the contents when the lighthouse was decommissioned. Emma moved through the space slowly, lifting sheets to reveal furniture that was old but appeared well-made and potentially salvageable. A Dining table with 6 chairs. A writing desk with multiple drawers, built-in bookcases along the walls, and a sofa positioned near the fireplace. The furniture told the story of lighthouse keepers who had made this isolated station their home for decades. A narrow hallway led to what had been the kitchen, a large room with an enormous cast-iron stove, a deep soapstone sink with a hand pump, and extensive open shelving along the walls. Beyond that was a pantry and storage room that could be converted to modern utility space. The kitchen showed signs of the lighthouse's age, but the basic layout was functional and could accommodate modern appliances and plumbing with careful planning. A steep staircase led to the second floor, which contained 3 bedrooms of varying sizes and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub and pedestal sink. The largest bedroom had windows facing both the open ocean and the bay, providing panoramic views that would be spectacular once the boards were removed. The plumbing was obviously antiquated, but the fixtures were solid and potentially restorable. A door at the back of the main hallway connected the keeper's quarters directly to the lighthouse itself. Emma opened this door and found herself at the base of a spiral staircase that wound up into the lantern room. She began climbing carefully, testing each metal step before trusting it with her full weight. The staircase was solid despite its age, and climbing it felt like ascending through maritime history. The lantern room at the top took her breath away, not just from the climb, but from the spectacular 360-degree view of Penobscot Bay and the Atlantic Ocean stretching to the horizon. The massive Fresnel lens had been removed when the lighthouse was decommissioned, but the metal framework remained, along with the rotation mechanism that had once turned the beacon. From this height, Emma could see the full scope of her property and its dramatic setting. The lighthouse stood on approximately 5 acres of rocky terrain with natural landscaping of hardy coastal plants that had survived years of neglect. A small outbuilding near the keeper's quarters probably served as a workshop and storage facility. The property included its own freshwater well, though she would need to have the water tested before considering it safe for consumption. As a marine biologist, Emma assessed the property with both practical and ecological perspectives. The structure appeared remarkably sound despite 8 years of abandonment. The granite foundations were solid, the wooden frame showed no obvious signs of rot or insect damage, and the roof appeared intact without major leaks. The plumbing and electrical systems would require complete overhaul, but the building's bones were excellent. More importantly, the space felt right in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Standing in the lantern room, surrounded by windows that provided views in all directions, Emma felt a sense of peace and possibility she hadn't experienced since Michael's death. This lighthouse could become more than just shelter. It could become a home, a project, a purpose that honored both her need for security and her capacity for rebuilding. She descended the spiral staircase, planning to explore the basement level that had been briefly shown in the auction photographs. A wooden door off the kitchen led to a steep staircase descending into darkness. Emma used her phone's flashlight to illuminate the steps as she carefully made her way down. The basement was significantly larger than she'd expected, extending under most of the keeper's quarters with rough stone walls and massive timber support beams that spoke to the building's sturdy construction. The space was divided into several sections, a large central area that might have been used for storage, a small room that appeared to have housed the original coal furnace, and what looked like a workshop space with a sturdy wooden workbench along one wall. The ceiling height was surprisingly generous, nearly 7 feet, making the basement potentially usable space rather than merely utility access. Emma spent the rest of the afternoon exploring every corner of the property, taking notes about necessary repairs, potential improvements, and the sequence of work required to make the keeper's quarters livable. The immediate priorities were weatherproofing, utility connections, and basic safety improvements. The longer-term project would involve complete restoration while maintaining the lighthouse's historical character. As the sun began to set, Emma climbed back to the lantern room to watch the daily spectacle from her new vantage point. The view was breathtaking, the Atlantic Ocean stretching endlessly eastward, Penobscot Bay curving gracefully to the south, and the distant lights of coastal communities beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. For the first time since Michael's death, Emma felt something resembling hope. The lighthouse represented enormous challenges, but also enormous possibilities. She had taken the most desperate gamble of her life and found herself the owner of a property that could provide not just shelter, but purpose, beauty, and independence that no landlord could threaten. The drive back to her cottage that evening was subdued and reflective. Emma's mind raced with plans, priorities, and the overwhelming scope of work required to transform the lighthouse into her home. She would need to research contractors, apply for historical preservation grants, and develop a realistic timeline for the restoration project. More immediately, she had just 3 weeks remaining before her cottage eviction date. The lighthouse wasn't yet habitable, meaning she would need temporary housing while beginning the restoration work. Margaret Reynolds had mentioned the possibility of camping on the property during initial renovation phases, and Emma began considering whether that might be feasible with careful preparation. That evening, Emma researched lighthouse restoration in detail, reading about other successful projects and the typical challenges involved. She discovered that lighthouse preservation was a specialized field with its own community of experts, suppliers, and funding sources. Federal and state grants were available for historical lighthouse restoration, and several nonprofit organizations provided technical assistance for preservation projects. The more she learned, the more confident she became that her desperate purchase might actually be the beginning of something remarkable. The lighthouse offered not just housing security, but the possibility of creating something beautiful and meaningful while contributing to maritime heritage preservation, all while gaining secure housing and personal independence. As she prepared for bed in her cottage for one of the last times, Emma looked out at the distant lighthouse beam that had watched over her marriage for so many years. Tomorrow, that lighthouse would begin its transformation from abandoned relic to her new home. The widow, who had spent her last $150 on a sheriff's auction gamble, was about to discover that sometimes the most desperate choices lead to the most extraordinary opportunities. The morning after purchasing the lighthouse, Emma awoke in her cottage with a mixture of exhilaration and terror coursing through her veins. In the harsh light of day, her $150 gamble seemed either brilliantly inspired or catastrophically reckless, possibly both simultaneously. She had exactly 20 days remaining before her cottage eviction date, $97 left in her bank account, and a lighthouse that currently lacked electricity, running water, or any of the basic amenities required for human habitation. Emma spread her notes from yesterday's lighthouse exploration across her kitchen table alongside printed pages about lighthouse restoration, historical preservation requirements, and grant applications. The scope of work required was staggering, but she forced herself to approach it systematically, the way she'd once developed research methodologies for studying threatened marine ecosystems facing seemingly impossible recovery challenges. The immediate priorities were clear: secure temporary utilities, make the keeper's quarters weathertight, and establish basic habitability before her cottage lease expired. Everything else, proper restoration, historical preservation compliance, and long-term renovations, could be addressed gradually when she had shelter and stability. Emma's first call was to the local electric utility to inquire about reconnecting service to the lighthouse. The customer service representative seemed confused by the unusual request, eventually transferring her to a supervisor who specialized in rural and historical properties. "Ma'am, reconnecting utilities to a decommissioned lighthouse as well. It's not something we see very often," explained Supervisor Daniel Cahill. The service lines were permanently disconnected in 1989 when the Coast Guard abandoned the property. Restoring electrical service would require a complete infrastructure assessment, new meter installation, and potentially rebuilding portions of the transmission line depending on weather damage over the past 8 years. The estimated timeline was 4 to 6 weeks for electrical restoration, assuming no major complications. The cost would be substantial, potentially several $1,000s for the reconnection work alone, not including the lighthouse's internal wiring, which would need complete replacement to meet current building codes. Water service presented even greater challenges. The lighthouse had its own well system, but the pump, filtration, and distribution components hadn't been maintained for 8 years. Emma would need to hire a well service company to assess the water quality and system functionality before determining whether restoration was feasible or if alternative solutions were required. "I have to ask," Cahill said gently, "are you planning to live in this lighthouse? Because if so, you'll also need septic system assessment, building inspection certificates, and compliance with county habitability standards before we can establish permanent utility service." Emma explained her situation, the impending eviction, her limited resources, and her determination to make the lighthouse her home despite the challenges. Cahill's tone shifted from bureaucratic efficiency to genuine sympathy. "Look, I'm not supposed to suggest this, but given your circumstances, you might consider temporary RV-style utility connections while you work on permanent restoration. We can provide a temporary power pole installation that would give you basic electrical service, much faster than full infrastructure rebuilding. It's not a permanent solution, but it could get you lights and power tools while you work on the bigger project." This was exactly the kind of creative problem-solving Emma needed. The temporary power installation would cost about $750, still a significant expense given her resources, but manageable if she could find ways to cover other essential costs through grants or assistance programs. Emma spent the next 2 days researching every possible source of financial assistance for lighthouse restoration. The National Park Service offered grants for lighthouse preservation, but the application process typically took 6 months and required detailed architectural assessments she couldn't afford. The Maine Office of Historical Preservation had emergency grants for endangered historical structures, but these were limited to properties already listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The Penobscot Bay Historical Society maintained a fund for maritime heritage preservation, but their grants rarely exceeded $3,000 and were awarded only twice per year. Private foundations focused on lighthouse preservation existed, but most required extensive documentation and professional contractor estimates before considering applications. Emma discovered that the American Lighthouse Foundation operated a volunteer program that provided technical assistance and sometimes labor for worthy restoration projects. Their website featured several success stories of lighthouse owners who had accomplished remarkable restorations through determination, community support, and careful planning. She submitted an inquiry describing her situation and requesting guidance. The more she researched, the more Emma realized that lighthouse restoration was less about having enormous financial resources and more about patience, creativity, and willingness to learn specialized skills. Many successful projects had been completed by dedicated owners who approached restoration as a long-term commitment rather than a quick renovation. She found online forums where lighthouse owners shared advice, resources, and encouragement. The community was surprisingly active and supportive, with experienced restorers offering guidance to newcomers facing their first preservation challenges. Emma created an account and posted about her situation, receiving dozens of responses within hours. "The most important thing is weatherproofing and structural stability," wrote a forum member who had restored a lighthouse in Oregon. "Everything else can wait, but you can't let water damage destroy what you're trying to save. Focus on roof repairs, window sealing, and moisture control before worrying about cosmetic improvements." Another member who had converted a lighthouse keeper's quarters into her primary residence provided practical advice about utilities and habitability. Start with camping level comfort and upgrade gradually. A wood stove for heat, battery-powered lights, and a camping shower can keep you comfortable while you work on permanent systems. The key is making it livable, not perfect. The forum members also warned about common pitfalls in lighthouse restoration. Rushing the work led to costly mistakes and potential structural damage. Ignoring historical preservation requirements could result in legal complications and loss of grant eligibility. Most importantly, underestimating the physical and emotional demands of living in an active restoration project could lead to burnout and abandonment of the effort. Emma began developing a phased restoration plan based on the advice she'd gathered. Phase 1 would focus on basic habitability, weatherproofing, temporary utilities, essential safety improvements, and creating livable space in the keeper's quarters. Phase 2 would address permanent utility restoration, compliance with building codes, and major structural improvements. Phase 3 would involve historical preservation, cosmetic restoration, and returning the lighthouse to its former glory. The timeline for Phase 1 was aggressive, but necessary. She needed basic habitability within 3 weeks to avoid homelessness. Emma calculated that she could accomplish the essential work with careful prioritization and some creative problem-solving, especially if she could find contractors willing to work with her limited budget. Margaret Reynolds had provided several recommendations for contractors experienced with historical properties. Emma contacted each of them, explaining her situation and asking for estimates on the most critical work. Most were sympathetic but couldn't accommodate her urgent timeline or limited budget. However, one contractor, Jason Reed, offered a different approach. "I've worked on several lighthouse projects over the years," Jason explained during their phone conversation. "I understand the challenges you're facing, and I respect what you're trying to accomplish. I can't take on the full restoration project right now, but I could provide consultation and oversight while you handle much of the basic work yourself." Jason proposed working as a technical advisor rather than a general contractor. He would assess the lighthouse's structural condition, develop a prioritized work plan, and provide guidance while Emma performed tasks within her skill level. For specialized work requiring professional expertise, electrical, plumbing, structural modifications, he would coordinate with trusted subcontractors who might be willing to work with flexible payment arrangements. The key is understanding what you can safely do yourself and what requires professional expertise. Painting, basic carpentry, cleaning, and weatherproofing are well within most people's capabilities. Electrical work, major plumbing, and structural modifications need professional handling for safety and code compliance. This approach could dramatically reduce restoration costs while ensuring work was performed safely and correctly. Jason's consultation fee was reasonable, and his willingness to work with her financial constraints made the project seem feasible rather than impossible. Emma scheduled a meeting with Jason for the following day, planning to walk through the lighthouse together and develop a specific action plan for achieving basic habitability within her deadline. Meanwhile, she continued researching specific restoration techniques, material suppliers, and equipment rental options. The cottage eviction countdown had reached 18 days, creating increasing urgency around every decision and preparation. Emma began sorting her possessions, deciding what to keep, donate, or sell to generate additional funds for the lighthouse project. Most of her furniture would need to remain in storage until the lighthouse was properly restored, but essential items and tools could be moved immediately. Michael's marine equipment, stored in their garage since his death, suddenly became invaluable resources rather than painful reminders. His collection included quality hand tools, a portable generator, marine-grade waterproofing materials, and various specialized implements that would be essential for coastal restoration work. Emma had avoided the garage for months, but now she forced herself to inventory Michael's tools and equipment, recognizing how much money they would save on the lighthouse project. Among Michael's possessions, she discovered detailed notebooks where he'd recorded boat maintenance techniques, weather patterns, and lessons learned from decades on the water. His meticulous documentation included sketches of problem-solving approaches, supplier contacts, and cost-saving strategies developed over 20 years of maintaining his fishing boat in harsh maritime conditions. These notebooks would be invaluable guides for someone undertaking their first major coastal restoration project. Emma also found Michael's collection of nautical reference books, including several specifically about historical marine construction and preservation techniques. He had apparently harbored dreams of restoring an old boat someday, accumulating knowledge and resources for projects they'd never had the opportunity to pursue together. Discovering this hidden aspect of Michael's interests felt like receiving guidance from beyond, affirmation that her lighthouse gamble might honor his memory while securing her future. The American Lighthouse Foundation responded to her inquiry with encouraging news. While they couldn't provide immediate financial assistance, they offered to include Rock Point Lighthouse in their volunteer work weekend program. Experienced lighthouse restorers from throughout New England would be willing to donate labor for essential restoration work in exchange for the learning, opportunity, and community service satisfaction. We typically organize these volunteer weekends for lighthouse owners who demonstrate serious commitment to proper restoration, explained Program Coordinator Robert McKenzie. Your situation sounds like exactly the kind of project our volunteers want to support. If you can provide basic materials and coordination, we could potentially accomplish weeks of work in a single weekend. The volunteer weekend program was scheduled quarterly, with the next opportunity occurring in 7 weeks too late for Emma's immediate habitability needs, but perfect timing for major restoration once she'd established basic living conditions. Robert provided a detailed list of work typically accomplished during volunteer weekends: roofing repairs, exterior painting, window restoration, landscaping, and general structural improvements. Emma realized that her lighthouse restoration was becoming less of a solitary struggle and more of a community effort, involving people who shared her commitment to maritime heritage preservation. This network of support made the enormous challenges seem manageable through collective action and shared expertise. The meeting with contractor Jason Reed the following day exceeded Emma's most optimistic expectations. Jason arrived at the lighthouse with his assistant Samantha and spent 3 hours conducting a thorough structural assessment of both the tower and keeper's quarters. His evaluation confirmed what Emma had hoped: the lighthouse was in remarkably good condition considering 8 years of abandonment. "This is solid construction," Jason declared, examining the granite foundation and wooden frame structure. "Whoever built this lighthouse knew what they were doing. The materials are high quality, the craftsmanship is excellent, and the basic structure has withstood decades of coastal storms without significant damage." Jason identified the critical work required for basic habitability: roof patching in 3 locations where weather had penetrated, window sealing to prevent further moisture infiltration, chimney cleaning and fireplace safety inspection, and basic plumbing restoration to provide running water. The electrical system would require professional assessment before any power restoration could be attempted. "The good news is that most of this work is within your capabilities," Jason explained. "Roof patching, window sealing, and basic cleaning don't require specialized expertise, just careful attention to detail and proper materials. I can show you the techniques and supervise the critical steps." Jason estimated that basic habitability could be achieved within 3 weeks if Emma dedicated full-time effort to the project. The material costs would be approximately $1,800, stretching her budget but manageable if she could secure the temporary utility connections and avoid any major surprises. Samantha, who had remained quietly observant during the assessment, finally spoke up. "Jason, this reminds me of the lighthouse project we worked on in Gloucester. Same era construction, similar condition, and the owner accomplished an amazing restoration over 2 years." "Samantha's right," Jason agreed. "This property has exceptional potential. You're not just buying shelter, you're acquiring a piece of Maritime history that could become something truly special with proper restoration. As they concluded the assessment, Jason provided Emma with a detailed work plan prioritized by urgency and safety requirements. He also offered to arrange favorable pricing on materials through his supplier relationships, potentially saving hundreds of dollars on the restoration costs. "I want to see this project succeed," Jason told Emma as they shook hands. "Lighthouse preservation is important work, and you're approaching it with the right attitude. Call me when you're ready to begin, and we'll make sure you have the guidance you need." That evening, Emma sat in her cottage kitchen surrounded by restoration plans, supplier catalogs, and budget calculations that told a story of hope balanced precariously against financial reality. Jason Reed had provided a detailed assessment confirming that basic habitability could be achieved within her timeline, but the costs would consume every remaining dollar she possessed, plus the small emergency fund she'd been hoarding for absolute catastrophe. The temporary electrical connection alone would cost $750, leaving her with barely enough for essential materials and no margin for unexpected complications. Emma stared at the lighthouse restoration plan she'd developed over the past 3 days. Phase 1 required immediate investments totaling approximately $2,500 money she didn't have but could possibly acquire by selling everything of value she owned. Her wedding ring, which she'd been unable to part with despite desperate circumstances, could bring perhaps $600 from a pawn shop. Michael's marine equipment might generate another $800 to $1,000 if she could bear to sell the physical remnants of his passion. Her car, while necessary for transportation to the lighthouse, could be downgraded to an older, cheaper vehicle, freeing up $2,000 to $3,000 in equity. The mathematics were brutal, but clear she could fund the lighthouse restoration, but only by liquidating every safety net and backup plan she possessed. Success would mean achieving housing security and beginning a meaningful new chapter. Failure would mean homelessness with no resources remaining for recovery. Emma picked up her phone to call Jason Reed, then set it down again. She walked to the living room window and gazed out at the lighthouse standing sentinel on its rocky promontory. From this distance, it looked solid and permanent, a structure that had weathered 140 years of coastal storms and could provide shelter for decades more if properly maintained. But up close, she knew it represented the greatest risk she'd ever taken. Her phone rang, interrupting her brooding contemplation. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. "Miss Sullivan, this is Dr. Andrew Parker from the Maine Maritime Heritage Foundation. I understand you recently acquired Rock Point Lighthouse and are planning a restoration project." Emma's pulse quickened. She hadn't contacted the Maritime Heritage Foundation, meaning word about her lighthouse purchase was spreading through historical preservation circles faster than she'd expected. "Yes, that's correct," Emma replied cautiously. "May I ask how you learned about my project?" "Jason Reed mentioned your situation when he inquired about historical preservation grants on your behalf. I hope you don't mind that he took that initiative. He's worked with our foundation on several lighthouse projects and thought we might be able to assist your efforts." Dr. Parker explained that the Maritime Heritage Foundation maintained an emergency preservation fund, specifically for endangered lighthouse properties. They had been monitoring Rock Point for several years, hoping someone would acquire it before weather damage caused irreversible deterioration. "We're prepared to offer a $3,500 emergency preservation grant to support your restoration efforts," Dr. Parker continued. "The funds are specifically designated for structural preservation work, roofing, foundation maintenance, weatherproofing, rather than cosmetic improvements. Would this type of assistance be helpful for your project?" Emma nearly dropped the phone. The grant would cover her entire Phase 1 budget, with money remaining for unexpected expenses. More importantly, it represented validation from preservation professionals that her lighthouse restoration was worth supporting. "Dr. Parker, this would be incredibly helpful," Emma managed, trying to keep her voice steady. What requirements are attached to the grant? The Foundation's requirements were reasonable and aligned with Emma's restoration plans. The work must be performed according to historical preservation standards, documented with photographs and progress reports, and the lighthouse must be maintained as a historical property in perpetuity. Grant recipients also agreed to provide periodic tours for Foundation members and participate in maritime heritage education programs. We'll need to inspect the property and review your restoration plans before finalizing the grant. Could we schedule a site visit for this weekend? If everything looks appropriate, we could have funds available by early next week. Emma scheduled the site visit for Saturday morning, giving her 2 days to refine her restoration plans and prepare for the Foundation's evaluation. The grant opportunity transformed her impossible gamble into a feasible project with professional support and credibility. After ending the call, Emma immediately contacted Jason Reed to thank him for the Foundation referral and schedule the beginning of restoration work. Jason was delighted by the grant news and suggested accelerating their timeline to take advantage of the additional resources. With the Foundation grant, we can do this properly rather than just surviving, he explained. We can use quality materials, hire professional help for the specialized work, and establish a solid foundation for long-term restoration success. Jason proposed beginning work the following Monday, giving Emma the weekend to complete her cottage packing and prepare for the transition to lighthouse living. He would coordinate material deliveries, arrange the temporary electrical installation, and supervise the critical structural work during her first week of residence. One more thing, Jason added. Samantha and I discussed your project last night, and we'd like to volunteer some of our time to help you get established. This kind of lighthouse preservation is important work, and we want to see you succeed. The unexpected generosity from professionals who barely knew her reinforced Emma's growing sense that the lighthouse restoration was meant to happen. People were emerging from nowhere to offer assistance, expertise, and encouragement for a project that had seemed impossibly isolated just days earlier. Emma spent the next 2 days in a frenzy of preparation that felt simultaneously like packing for expedition and preparing for siege. She sorted her possessions into categories: essential items for lighthouse living, things to store until restoration was complete, and belongings to sell for additional project funding. The cottage that had been her sanctuary was systematically dismantled as she prepared for a completely different life. Michael's marine equipment and tools were carefully inventoried and packed for transport to the lighthouse. His journals and reference materials joined her growing library of restoration resources. She kept his wedding band, but reluctantly decided to sell her own. The lighthouse project needed funding more than she needed symbolic jewelry, and Michael would have understood the practical choice. The pawn shop transaction was emotionally brutal but financially necessary. Emma's wedding ring, purchased during happier times when the future seemed secure, brought $575 that would fund essential supplies and emergency reserves. Walking away from the pawn shop felt like severing another connection to her former life, but also like shedding weight that had been holding her back. Friday evening, Emma stood in her nearly empty cottage, surrounded by boxes and bags containing everything she would need for lighthouse living. The cottage had been her home for 15 years, the backdrop to her marriage and the sanctuary where she'd grieved Michael's death. Leaving it felt like abandoning the last physical connection to their life together. But as she looked out the window at Rock Point Lighthouse, Emma realized she wasn't abandoning her past, she was carrying it forward into something new. Michael's tools would help restore the lighthouse. His maritime knowledge preserved in his journals would guide her work. His memory would inspire her determination to succeed at this impossible project. Saturday morning brought Dr. Andrew Parker and 2 Foundation colleagues to evaluate the lighthouse and Emma's restoration plans. Dr. Parker was a maritime historian with extensive experience in lighthouse preservation. His companions were architect Lydia Chun, who specialized in historical building restoration, and Daniel Rodriguez, whose expertise covered coastal structure maintenance and storm protection. The foundation team spent 3 hours conducting a thorough examination of both the lighthouse tower and keeper's quarters. They photographed structural details, measured critical dimensions, and assessed the condition of materials and systems throughout the property. Emma followed along, answering questions about her restoration timeline and explaining her background and commitment to the project. "This is exactly the kind of preservation project our foundation wants to support," Dr. Parker declared after completing the assessment. "The structure is in excellent condition considering its age and abandonment period. Your restoration plan is realistic and appropriately phased. Most importantly, you clearly understand the historical significance of what you're undertaking." Architect Lydia Chun was particularly impressed by the lighthouse construction quality and original design elements. "This represents outstanding 19th century lighthouse engineering," she explained. "The granite foundation work is exceptional. The wooden frame construction is solid and well designed, and most of the original architectural details remain intact. Restoration should preserve and highlight these historical features rather than modernizing them out of existence." Marine engineer Daniel Rodriguez focused on the lighthouse's ability to withstand coastal storms and salt air exposure. "The builders understood the environmental challenges," he noted. "The structure is properly positioned to deflect storm surge. The materials were chosen for corrosion resistance, and the overall design has proven its durability through 140 years of service." The foundation team's enthusiasm for the project exceeded Emma's most optimistic expectations. They approved the $3,500 emergency preservation grant on the spot and discussed additional funding opportunities that might become available as restoration progressed. "We'd also like to document your restoration process for our educational programs," Dr. Parker proposed. "Lighthouse preservation is a specialized field, and your project could provide valuable learning opportunities for other property owners and preservation professionals." Emma readily agreed to documentation and education participation. The foundation's involvement would provide ongoing technical support and credibility that could attract additional resources and volunteer assistance. Sunday evening, Emma's final night in the cottage. She sat on the porch, watching the lighthouse beam sweep across Penobscot Bay. Tomorrow, she would begin living in that lighthouse, sleeping in rooms where generations of lighthouse keepers had maintained their vigil over maritime navigation. The transition felt simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. Her sister called from Arizona, checking on her situation and expressing concern about her lighthouse gamble. Emma tried to explain the support network that had emerged around the project, the professional validation from preservation experts, and her growing confidence that the restoration could succeed. "Emma, I respect what you're trying to do," her sister said carefully. "But this sounds incredibly risky. You're committing everything you have to a project with no guaranteed outcome. What happens if the restoration costs more than you expect, or if you can't make it livable quickly enough?" These were valid concerns that Emma had wrestled with extensively. The lighthouse restoration was indeed a gamble with her entire future as the stakes. But the alternative, accepting homelessness or settling for inadequate housing, she couldn't afford, offered even less security and no possibility of building something meaningful. "I know it's risky," Emma replied. "But sometimes the biggest risks offer the only real opportunities for change. I can't afford to play it safe anymore, because safe options don't exist in my situation. The lighthouse gives me a chance to create security that no one can take away." Monday morning arrived with crystalline clarity and a sense of momentous transition. Emma loaded her car with essential belongings, took a final walk through the empty cottage, and drove toward Rock Point to begin her new life as a lighthouse keeper and restorer. Jason Reed and Samantha were already at the lighthouse when she arrived, unloading materials and equipment for the restoration work. The temporary electrical installation crew was scheduled to arrive at 10 a.m., and the well service company would assess the water system that afternoon. "Ready to make history?" Jason asked with a grin as Emma parked beside the lighthouse. "This is going to be an adventure." Emma looked up at the lighthouse tower rising against the morning sky, then at the keeper's quarters that would become her home through determination and community support. The gamble was no longer theoretical, it was beginning in earnest. "Let's build something beautiful," she replied, shouldering her bag and walking toward the lighthouse door. The first week of lighthouse living tested every assumption Emma had made about the restoration project. Despite Jason's expert guidance and the foundation grant providing adequate funding, the reality of inhabiting a structure abandoned for 8 years while simultaneously renovating it proved more challenging than any planning could have anticipated. Yet by Friday evening, as Emma stood in the lantern room watching the sunset paint Penobscot Bay in brilliant oranges and purples, she felt more at home than she had since Michael's death. The temporary electrical installation had been completed on schedule, providing basic lighting and power for essential tools. The well service assessment revealed surprisingly good news. The lighthouse's freshwater system was intact and functional, requiring only new filtration equipment and updated plumbing connections to provide safe drinking water. Jason and Samantha had made remarkable progress on weatherproofing, sealing windows, and repairing roof damage with efficiency that spoke of extensive experience with coastal restoration projects. Most importantly, the keeper's quarters had been transformed from an abandoned relic into a livable space. Emma had established her bedroom in the largest, second-floor room with panoramic windows providing views of both the Atlantic Ocean and Penobscot Bay. A camping shower and portable toilet provided basic bathroom facilities, while the permanent plumbing was restored. The main floor served as her living space with the massive granite fireplace providing both heat and a sense of cozy domesticity that made the lighthouse feel like home rather than a construction site. Dr. Andrew Parker had commented during his Wednesday progress visit, "You've accomplished something remarkable here. Most lighthouse restorations take months to reach this level of habitability. Your determination and Jason's expertise have created something special." The Maritime Heritage Foundation had been documenting the restoration process for their educational programs, with professional photographers capturing both the technical work and the human story of Emma's transformation from desperate widow to lighthouse keeper. The foundation was already discussing featuring Rock Point in their annual preservation report and potentially nominating the property for inclusion on the National Register of Historic Places. Emma had fallen into a routine that felt both purposeful and sustainable. Mornings were dedicated to restoration work, painting, cleaning, minor repairs, and gradually improving the lighthouse's condition and functionality. Afternoons were reserved for research, planning future improvements, and correspondence with the growing network of supporters and advisors who had emerged around the project. Evenings belonged to exploration and reflection. Emma would climb to the lantern room to watch the sunset, then spend time reading about lighthouse history and preservation techniques, or simply sitting by the fireplace and processing the enormous changes in her life. The isolation that had initially seemed daunting had become peaceful, a sanctuary where she could rebuild both the lighthouse and herself without external pressures or expectations. The lighthouse itself was revealing its secrets gradually. Emma had discovered evidence of previous keepers throughout the structure, carved initials on wooden beams, faded photographs tucked behind bookcases, personal items forgotten in storage areas. Each discovery added to her understanding of the lighthouse's human history and her connection to the generations of people who had called this place home. Friday morning brought an unexpected visitor. Emma was working in the main living area, stripping old paint from built-in bookcases, when she heard a vehicle approaching on the coastal road. Through the window, she saw a weathered pickup truck parking near the lighthouse, followed by an elderly man walking slowly toward the keeper's quarters. Emma opened the door before he could knock, curious about who would visit her isolated lighthouse. The man was clearly nervous, clutching a worn canvas hat and looking around the property with obvious familiarity. "Excuse me, miss," he said with a slight Maine accent that suggested decades of local residence. "I'm William Barrett. I heard someone was restoring the lighthouse, and I grew up here. My father was the lighthouse keeper from 1918 to 1947. Emma's pulse quickened. The county clerk had mentioned Thomas Barrett as one of the most documented lighthouse keepers, a man who had maintained extensive records of maritime activity and local history. Meeting his son felt like connecting directly to the lighthouse's human heritage. "Please come in," Emma said warmly. "I'm Emma Sullivan, the new owner. I'd love to hear about your father and your memories of living here." William, who asked to be called Bill, stepped into the keeper's quarters with obvious emotion. He moved slowly through the rooms, touching familiar surfaces and commenting on changes and improvements Emma had made. His familiarity with the space was intimate and detailed, the knowledge of someone who had spent childhood years exploring every corner of the lighthouse. "This brings back so many memories," Bill said, standing in the kitchen where Emma had set up a temporary cooking area. "My mother used to make chowder on that old wood stove. We had chickens in the yard and a vegetable garden where you've cleared that brush. My father was so proud of maintaining this lighthouse. He treated it like a sacred responsibility." Bill explained that his father had been one of the dedicated lighthouse keepers who personally maintained the beacon and weather monitoring equipment before automation eliminated the need for human operators. Thomas Barrett had kept detailed logs not just of ships and weather, but of local history, wildlife observations, and significant events affecting the Penobscot Bay area. After the Coast Guard took over the lighthouse operations in the late 1930s, my father stayed on as the keeper until his retirement. When he finally had to leave in 1947, it broke his heart. He devoted nearly 30 years to this place, and leaving felt like abandoning a family member. Emma shared her restoration plans and the support she'd received from the Maritime Heritage Foundation. Bill was delighted by her commitment to historical preservation and offered to share family photographs and documents that could assist with authentic restoration details. "There's something else," Bill said hesitantly. "My father left some materials here when the lighthouse was decommissioned. Personal items and records that he couldn't bear to remove. The Coast Guard told him to take whatever he wanted, but he said some things belonged with the lighthouse forever. I wonder if you found any of his materials during your restoration work." Emma hadn't discovered any significant personal items, though she'd found various small artifacts throughout the lighthouse. She offered to show Bill around the property, hoping his knowledge might help locate whatever his father had left behind. They began in the main living areas where Bill pointed out modifications his father had made over the years: additional shelving, a small workshop area, improvements to the kitchen layout. His stories brought the lighthouse's history alive, transforming the space from an abandoned building into a place where real people had lived, worked, and created memories. The tour continued to the second floor, where Bill identified which room had been his childhood bedroom and described the view he'd enjoyed of ships. Entering Penobscot Bay, he showed Emma a loose floorboard where he'd hidden childhood treasures and pointed out pencil marks on a doorframe, where his father had measured his growth over the years. "The place I really want to check is the basement," Bill said as they descended to the main floor. "My father had a workshop space down there where he kept his navigation equipment and weather instruments. If he left anything behind, it would probably be in a sealed container or hidden somewhere protected from moisture." Emma led him to the basement stairs, explaining that she'd only briefly explored the area while assessing the lighthouse's overall condition. The basement was dim despite the temporary work lights she'd installed, with shadows gathering in the corners of the stone-walled space. Bill surveyed the cluttered area with disappointment. "This is much worse than I expected." Water damage has destroyed most of what was stored here. But my father was careful about protecting important materials. If anything survived, it would be in a sealed container or hidden somewhere protected from moisture. They began systematically searching through the debris, with Bill explaining what various items had been used for during his father's tenure as lighthouse keeper. Most materials were beyond salvage, deteriorated by years of exposure to coastal humidity and occasional leaks. Emma was moving a stack of water-damaged wooden crates when she noticed something unusual about the wall behind them. While most of the basement was constructed with rough granite blocks, this section showed different materials and construction techniques. The wall appeared newer, with different mortar and more regular stones than the surrounding structure. "Bill, does this wall look right to you?" Emma asked, running her hand along the irregular surface. Bill examined the wall section carefully, his expression shifting from curiosity to excitement. "This isn't original construction," he declared. "This looks like a modification my father made sometime in the 1930s. He was always working on improvements to make the lighthouse more efficient and comfortable." As they cleared more debris from that area, the extent of the wall modification became apparent. A section approximately 5 feet wide had been constructed differently from the surrounding structure, with materials that didn't match the lighthouse's original construction. The workmanship was careful and deliberate, suggesting this wasn't a quick repair, but a planned modification. Emma noticed that one section of the modified wall showed signs of stress and separation. The mortar appeared to be crumbling in a pattern that suggested deliberate weakening rather than random deterioration. "This looks like it might be designed to open," Emma observed, examining the pattern more closely. "The construction seems designed for access rather than permanent closure." Bill's excitement was growing as he studied the wall section. "My father was incredibly secretive about some of his projects. He always said the lighthouse had hidden aspects that weren't documented in the official records. I wonder if this is what he meant." They spent several minutes examining the modified wall section, looking for hinges, latches, or other hardware that might indicate how it was designed to open. Finally, Bill discovered a small metal lever concealed behind a support beam. When he pressed it, they heard a distinct clicking sound from within the wall. "Try pushing on this section," Bill suggested, indicating the area where the mortar was most deteriorated. Emma applied pressure to the wall section, and to her amazement, it began to move inward on concealed hinges. The modification was revealed to be a carefully constructed hidden door, designed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding wall when closed, but providing access to a concealed space beyond. "My God," Bill whispered as the hidden door opened completely. "My father actually did it. He created a secret room." The concealed space beyond the hidden door was approximately 10 feet square with a low ceiling that required them to stoop slightly. Unlike the basement they'd been searching, this hidden chamber showed no signs of water damage or deterioration. The air was surprisingly dry and cool, suggesting the space had been well sealed against moisture infiltration. Emma directed her flashlight into the chamber, revealing a space that had clearly been used for storage of valuable or sensitive materials. Wooden shelves lined the walls, holding various items that had been carefully preserved over the decades. A small table occupied the center of the room, with what appeared to be documents and equipment arranged on its surface. "This is incredible," Emma breathed, stepping carefully into the hidden chamber. "Your father created a perfect preservation environment." Bill followed her into the space, his amazement evident as they began examining the carefully preserved materials. The shelves contained navigation instruments, a brass sextant, several compasses, and what appeared to be a small telescope. Leather-bound books filled one section, their bindings cracked with age but still intact. But it was the table at the center of the room that captured their immediate attention. Spread across its surface were charts and maps that appeared much older than anything Thomas Barrett could have used during his lighthouse-keeping years. The paper was aged and yellowed, with handwritten notations in faded ink that suggested considerable antiquity. Emma carefully lifted one of the maps, examining it in the beam of her flashlight. The coastline depicted was recognizable as the Penobscot Bay area, but rendered in a style that suggested the chart was much older than the lighthouse itself. Small symbols and notations were scattered across the map, with handwritten text in what appeared to be a coded system. "Bill, look at this," Emma said, her voice filled with wonder. "These maps look like they might be from the Prohibition-era. The style and material suggest they're much older than anything from your father's official duties." Bill examined the charts over her shoulder, his excitement growing as he recognized the implications. "My father always said he'd discovered materials in the lighthouse that predated his tenure. He thought previous activities on the site had left historical evidence that was too valuable to discard." Emma continued examining the materials on the table, discovering what appeared to be a journal bound in cracked leather. The pages were filled with entries in elegant handwriting, with dates that seemed to span several years in the early 1920s. The language was cryptic, mixing standard English with what appeared to be code words and coordinates. "This is a smuggler's logbook," Emma declared, carefully turning the brittle pages. "But it's much more organized than I would have expected from typical rum-runners. This appears to be from a sophisticated operation during the height of Prohibition." As she continued reading, she found entries that made her pulse quicken with excitement, references to diamond shipments, detailed descriptions of coastal drop points, and what appeared to be precise directions for locating concealed caches along the coastline. "Bill," Emma said barely above a whisper, "I think your father discovered evidence of a major smuggling operation. These documents appear to be instructions for finding hidden contraband along this coast." The logbook identified its author as Captain James Blackwood, operating a vessel called the Nightingale between various ports along the Atlantic coast between 1921 and 1927. The entries described sophisticated smuggling operations, encounters with Coast Guard patrols, and most significantly, the establishment of hidden caches at strategic locations along the coastline. "This is extraordinary," Emma breathed, realizing the implications of their discovery. "We're looking at authentic documentation of Prohibition-era diamond smuggling, hidden for nearly a century and preserved by your father's careful stewardship." Bill was equally amazed by the discovery, understanding that they had uncovered materials of immense historical significance. "My father always said this lighthouse held secrets that went far beyond its official history. I never imagined he meant anything like this." As they continued examining the hidden chamber's contents, Emma discovered additional items that supported the authenticity of Captain Blackwood's records, a small leather pouch containing uncut diamonds that matched the descriptions in the logbook, navigation instruments of the appropriate age and style, and what appeared to be coded messages mentioned in the smuggling operation inventories. "The question," Emma said, carefully closing the ancient logbook, "is whether any of these diamond caches still exist, and if so, whether they can be located using Captain Blackwood's directions." Bill examined the maps more closely, recognizing many of the landmarks and geographical features described in the historical documents. "These directions are incredibly detailed," he observed. Captain Blackwood was clearly a skilled navigator who understood the importance of precise location data. Emma realized that their discovery represented far more than historical curiosity. If authentic and accurate, Captain Blackwood's maps could potentially lead to discoveries that would not only secure her financial future, but contribute significantly to understanding Prohibition-era coastal history. As the sun set over Penobscot Bay, Emma and Bill carefully documented their discovery, photographing each item and recording detailed descriptions of the hidden chamber's contents. The lighthouse that had been purchased as his desperate shelter had revealed itself as the guardian of historical secrets that could transform everything. The widow who had risked her last $150 on an abandoned lighthouse was now the keeper of authentic smuggler's maps, 100-year-old navigation charts, and documentation of Prohibition-era activities that historians had long suspected but never proven. Thomas Barrett's careful preservation had protected these materials for decades, waiting for someone with the determination to uncover their secrets. Emma's lighthouse restoration had become something far more significant than housing security. It had become the beginning of a historical adventure that would test her courage, challenge her assumptions, and potentially rewrite the maritime history of the Maine coast. Over the following weeks, Emma worked with the Maine Maritime Heritage Foundation to authenticate and study the Blackwood documents. Experts confirmed that the maps, logbooks, and artifacts were genuine, Prohibition-era materials related to a sophisticated smuggling operation that had used the Maine coastline to import both illegal alcohol and uncut diamonds. Following Captain Blackwood's meticulously documented coordinates, Emma and a small team of Foundation archaeologists located 3 intact caches along the rocky coastline near the lighthouse. The discoveries included hundreds of uncut diamonds that had been sealed in waterproof containers and concealed in natural caves just above the high tide line. The diamond discovery, legally declared a historical find rather than abandoned property, was valued at over $2 million. Under Maine's historical preservation laws, Emma was entitled to a substantial finder's fee, while the remainder would be shared between the Foundation and the State Historical Commission. Her portion, nearly $1 million, provided more than enough funding to complete the lighthouse restoration and establish the Rock Point Maritime History Center, which would preserve and display the Blackwood collection while educating visitors about coastal Maine's complex smuggling history. 2 years after her desperate $150 lighthouse purchase, Emma Sullivan stood in the lantern room of her fully restored lighthouse, watching the sunset over Penobscot Bay. The keeper's quarters below had been transformed into both a comfortable home and a small museum where visitors could learn about lighthouse history and the remarkable Blackwood smuggling operation. What had begun as a last resort gamble to avoid homelessness had evolved into a meaningful life, purpose-preserving maritime history while creating something beautiful and enduring. The lighthouse that had once represented her most desperate hour now symbolized her most triumphant achievement. Emma often thought about how close she had come to giving up, how easily she might have missed the extraordinary opportunity hidden behind a failing wall. She thought about Michael, whose tools and journals had helped her begin the restoration, and Thomas Barrett, whose secret preservation efforts had protected historical treasures for decades. She had become part of a chain of keepers, people who understood that some lights were meant to be maintained, not just for navigation, but for connection to our shared human history. The struggling widow who had spent her last dollars on a crumbling lighthouse had discovered that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't found in hidden chambers or smugglers' caches. Sometimes they're found in the courage to take impossible chances, the determination to rebuild what's broken, and the wisdom to recognize that our darkest moments often conceal our brightest possibilities. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.